Good morning, welcome to BBC Newsroom Live. I'm Carrie Gracie and we'll just start with some breaking news on the death of John McCririck, the racing broadcaster. His family have announced that he's died aged 79. He was of course the face of Channel 4 racing, one of the sport's most recognisable figures, famous for his idiosyncratic fashion sense and his larger-than-life personality. He was, of course, also an award-winning journalist for The Sporting Life, and he worked for ITV before he worked for Channel 4. So the death announced this morning in the last few minutes of John McCririck, the racing broadcaster. We will have more on that during the hour. Now back to the breaking news in the last few moments that journalist and broadcaster John McCririck has died, aged 79. That's an announcement from his family. Let's talk now to the BBC's racing correspondent Cornelius Lysaght. Cornelius, tell us about John McCririck.
John McCririck has been one of the biggest faces, the noisiest voices as well on British television, I suppose, since getting his big break in the TV media in the 1980s, famous for wearing deerstalker hats, waving his arms around, booming voice. I'm talking to you from Sandown Park Racecourse and looking down on the betting ring, quiet at the moment. There'll be many people who have memories of his voice echoing around the place on Channel 4 television in the past. But as well as being this well-known broadcaster, and people have always said that in terms of racing, he was one of the absolute number one or two best-known faces. He was a very successful journalist as well, investigative journalist, and a very colourful figure, very well-known figure, but a controversial one as well. And there were plenty of people who felt his attitude towards women, his wife Jenny, who he always nicknamed the Booby, this constantly caused controversy. So a very successful broadcaster, a very successful investigative journalist, but on occasions highly controversial figure as well.
And I'm just reading, as well as I'm listening to you, Cornelius, that he started life as the school bookie, so his kind of, punditry began early.
Yeah, he went to Harrow School, and the late BBC racing presenter Julian Wilson and he were contemporaries at Harrow School, where that's where things started. He always described himself as a failed bookmaker. And he certainly had stood in betting rings as a bookmaker in the past, but then became this very successful journalist. He won awards for his investigative journalism, particularly with the now defunct Sporting Life newspaper, and then became this very big figure, first of all in Channel 4 racing, and then on a much wider television, to a wider television audience. I think Big Brother, those type of reality programs, he became a slightly unlikely star of.
And we're just looking at pictures of him in the past in that deerstalker hat. I mean, obviously, as you were saying, famous for that, that dress sense. I won't give it an adjective. But was he the same person in private as in public? This very much larger than life figure, is that the person you knew?
I sat next to him in racing media centres for years and years, and he was also a really kind person. He was always keen to help. If he could give a little bit of information here or there. I remember the BBC 5 Live team won a major award about 15 years ago. The following morning, he was the first on the phone to say, "Well done." However, all that said, I do recall his wife once saying to me, "Would you mind giving John a lift back from Doncaster races to London? He never drove. Would you mind giving him a lift back?" He wouldn't get into the front seat of the car when we got to the car park. And as we drove out, he was in the back. He opened the window and he was waving at the crowds as though he was some kind of a monarch. So he was, he was a larger-than-life, very colourful character. But just sitting quietly in the media centre of a racecourse, he couldn't have been kinder or more caring.
Well, it's lovely to hear those insights to his past. And I just want to pick up on something you mentioned a few moments ago, because, of course, younger generations won't be as familiar with his past as an investigative reporter. So was he breaking investigations into the murkier sides of the racing industry then?
Yeah, well, I think greyhound racing was an area that he looked at very closely. He was a great champion, as well as being this broadcaster. He was a champion for the punter. So whether it was greyhound racing or horse racing or something that he considered was unjust, he really wanted to bang the drum for that. He was unquestionably a very complex character. He had a considerable breadth as an entertainer, of course, but also as somebody who really cared for the punter, and he himself was a punter. So he was always keen to wave that particular flag as well. He'd been unwell for some time. He'd become increasingly frail in recent months, and also he lost an employment case against Channel 4, and that hit him very hard. So he used to in the last year, 18 months or so, he was increasingly frail and slightly felt as though he wasn't appreciated in quite the way he had been. But in the 80s and 90s, he was a massive figure across British racing and British television.
Well, I'm glad we've had the opportunity to talk about that with you, Cornelius. It's been lovely to talk to you. Take care.
Thank you.
The racing pundit John McCririck has died at the age of 79. McCririck made his career as the face of Channel 4's racing coverage. He was also famous for his larger-than-life personality and his signature deerstalker hat. He appeared on reality TV shows such as Celebrity Big Brother and Celebrity Wife Swap. Well, we'll speak now to Neil Clark from the Racing Post. Neil, thanks so much for talking to us.
Hi there.
We'll come to the celebrity aspect in a moment, but first, as a racing pundit, how important a figure was he to all of you who live in that world?
He was incredibly important because back in the 1980s, he really became the face of racing, didn't he, on Channel 4 Racing. He was so recognisable. He was, you never saw him without that huge cigar and that deerstalker. And he brought into the sport, I think this is the key point, he brought into the sport people who weren't necessarily keen racing fans, sort of members of the public who turned on and were entertained by his style because he was always bombastic, he was always opinionated, and he was never boring. And I think that was very, very important. He did bring in many, many more viewers to watch racing, and he did a lot for our sport to publicise it. And I think he's much missed. And I think that recent years racing coverage has tended to become a little bit too serious, a little bit too much more serious. And I think we lack the sort of characters, if you like John McCririck, and also people like Derek Thompson, who I think was on our TV a lot. He was another great one. And so I think that he is a sad loss.
And did he know his stuff the way that other racing journalists know their stuff?
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't a case of him just shouting out bombast. He studied the form. He was very hardworking. You go into the press room and he'd always be there studying the Racing Post or the Sporting Life. He knew what he was talking about. And so there was it wasn't a case of him just going in there to show off and to shout off his mouth. Let's face it, also, he wasn't everybody's cup of tea. We've got to admit that. I'm a good friend of a man called Sir Rupert Mackerson, who was at school with him at Harrow, the same house. He's got some stories to tell about him which are not so flattering. He wasn't everybody's cup of tea. He alienated opinion. He was a bit like Marmite, really. You either loved him or you hated him. But what you couldn't do was ignore him. And I think that's the key point. He did publicise the sport. He was the public face of it. And he brought people into it, which is what we want, because racing has to compete with lots of other sports, doesn't it, for coverage? And he helped do that.
And he did love the limelight, didn't he? I mean, coming back to what I was mentioning at the beginning, you know, the Celebrity Big Brother, the Celebrity Wife Swap, the Weakest Link, the kind of so many appearances on all those shows.
Well, we used to joke that he'd do anything to get in front of a camera, and there was that element about him. He was a showman. He loved to show off. And of course, I think one of the reasons he became ill was because he wasn't on the TV anymore. He lost his gig on the Channel 4 Racing when he went to ITV later. He wasn't on, and he felt very sad by that. He almost lived to be on the camera. It was quite sad, really, to be honest, that he felt he had to perform. And when that camera was switched off and he had no one watching him, he was sort of a lost soul. I remember seeing him in the press room and feeling very sorry for him. say 2 or 3 years ago, because he wasn't on TV. He was mooching around a bit. You could tell he really wanted to be out there, shouting, bombast, telling about the odds and all that sort of thing. And I think there was a lot of pathos in him in the final years, because he was a sort of lost soul. And he actually said that, didn't he? Last year he came on television and said he kind of lost the will to live because he wasn't on TV anymore. So I think he really lived to be on TV, certainly from the 80s onwards. And it was a kick and a buzz that he really missed.
Well, let's leave it with a happier thought, though. I mean, we were hearing earlier from our racing correspondent, Cornelius Lysett, that he could be at times a very kind man. And, I mean, give us your, your fondest memories, I suppose, of him.
Well, his persona, when I first went to the press room, he had a kind of fierce persona. You saw him on television. Often he got very bad temper with people, interrupting him, members of the public, told them to shut up, etc. So I remember once I had my coat in the press room, just behind where he was sitting, and he was working hard. Obviously, he had a deadline to meet. And I was a bit apprehensive about asking him if I could get in the way and take the coat. So I sort of plucked up courage and said, John, excuse me, can I get my coat? All sort of stuttering. And he said, of course, here you are, and gave me a big smile, all the best. And that's how he was. So often, behind that sort of exterior, which could be quite fierce at times, I think there was somebody who was very different. I think it was always difficult to say how much of the bombast he put on, how much of that was the real McCririck and how much of it was show. It's difficult to say, really. But certainly he was someone who did have his much quieter side. And when the camera was switched off, he was obviously a different person to when it was on. And though sometimes, of course, you couldn't really tell which was which because he got so used to playing that act, didn't he?
Neil, thanks so much for joining. It's lovely of you to come on and share your memories with us of John McCririck, who has died today, aged 79.
The horse racing pundit John McCririck has died at the age of 79. McCririck made his career as the face of Channel 4's racing coverage. He was famous for his larger-than-life personality and his signature deerstalker hat. He also appeared on reality TV shows such as Celebrity Big Brother and Celebrity Wife Swap. Derek Thompson is a horse racing broadcaster and long-time colleague of John McCririck. Derek, thank you so much for joining us. Share some of your thoughts, if you would, of what John was like as a friend and colleague.
He was an incredible man, Martine. To put it quite simply, he was the most professional journalist I've ever worked with. And I've worked with plenty. I worked with him for 35 years, and we sat alongside each other in the press room. And I'll tell you a true story about him. He had 2 of everything. He had 2 race cards, which he did his homework on. He had 2 watches. And I said to him one day, why do you do 2 of everything? And he said, well, in case I lose a watch, I lose a race card, or my watch stops. And he looked at me incredulously, and I said, yes, okay, I understand that. He was that professional. And the way he put things over, he endeared himself to the British racing public. He helped not put horse racing on the map, but he took it to a new level. He was incredible. He was always waving his hands around, top of the head, 6 to 4, 13 to 8, and all that, like it used to be in the old days. And I'll tell you a true story also. About 30 years ago, we had our Channel 4 meeting on a Saturday morning at York Racecourse. And I remember Andrew Franklin, the man who ran Channel 4 Racing, said, guys, I've had Channel 4 on. They want to do a 20-minute program for 5 weeks during the summer holidays, looking ahead to the afternoon's racing. What should we call it? And Big Mac shouted up, well, the morning line. It's got to be the morning line. And of course, everyone agreed straight away. And it ran for 35 years, not just 5 weeks. He was incredible. And it's very sad here in the news. He was ill. I know it was a blessing and all that, but it's very sad because it's a big void. People always say, it's a big void to fill. Nobody will be able to fill John McCririck's boots. He was incredible.
He was, for some people, though, a controversial figure, and that some of the views that he expressed were unpalatable. Some described them as misogynistic. I mean, his wife said it's absolute nonsense. So, which is the truth?
Well, the truth is he was a gentleman. He would open the door for a lady and all that. And remember, he was in a different age, Martine. It was the sort of 70s, 80s and 90s. And he called his wife, as we know, Jenny, he called her the booby, which was a silly thing to say. And she loved him. They lived together in London for so many years. And that's an old-fashioned thing to say. We would not be allowed to say it now. But that's what he called his wife. And He invented the word female. He used to call the assistant to him the female, but it was nothing being rude. It was just that in those days we would respond to emails on the morning line, and the lady who did it was a female. So he would say, "Here now with me is the female," and she loved it. There was never anything. Remember, it was TV. He was live. He was different. He was whiskers. He had the funny hat. He made jokes and all that and waved his hands about, but there was nothing malicious about it. And remember, he was Journalist of the Year not once but twice, so he was very good at making stories. You know, you're a trained journalist, he trained as a journalist. Admittedly, it was in the horse racing world, but he was somebody incredible. As I said, the most professional guy I've ever worked with.
Obviously very flamboyant and unforgettable on screen, but was he like that in real life, away from the cameras?
I'd love to say no, of course he wasn't, but yeah, he was. But that's the way he was. You know, whenever you went out for dinner, I stayed at his house, his flat in London a few times, and, you know, people, obviously, is instantly recognizable wherever he went, and he would lap it all up, and rightly so. But at the same time, he didn't suffer fools, gladly at all. He was right on the ball. He was a guy who did the best for his company and the people in his company. And as I said, when I found out that he'd passed away, I know he's 79, he'd been ill for some time, so as I say, it's a blessing. But at the same time, he's, you know, it's a very sad moment for me, for someone who sat next to him in the press room at the racecourses for over 30 years, you know. I still remember all the jokes, all the banter and all that. And you know, when I was presenting the Morning Line all those years, if ever I was in trouble, say, as you know, presenting a program, sometimes you don't hear the you know, it doesn't come out as it should be. I would always hand over to McCririck and say, "Big Mac, what's happening?" And he would always come back and save you. So for me, he was a guy I'll never forget. Rest in peace, John McCririck.
We all need colleagues like that. Derek Thompson, thank you very much. Thank you. Well, now, on the death of racing pundit John McCririck. He was 79. Famous for his eccentric style and his signature deerstalker hat, McCririck made his career as the face of Channel 4's racing coverage. Let's speak to our horse racing correspondent, Cornelius Lysett, who is at Sandown Park. Cornelius, how good was John McCririck for the sport of horse racing?
Oh, he was very good. People are talking here at Sandown today about what he contributed, and what I've thrown into the pot as people have discussed this is, I think over the last 35 years or so, the three best known faces associated with British racing have been Frankie Dettori, Her Majesty the Queen, particularly at Royal Ascot, and John McCririck. And John McCririck, we describe him as a racing pundit quite rightly, but he was this larger-than-life character who waved his arms around the whiskers and all the trademark rings on his fingers as well that you've talked about already. He made the sport of kings the sport of Big Mac for a period of time, so he gave it a massive boost, and profile is all important in this day and age for all sports, and he certainly played a big part in raising the profile of British racing.
Yeah, we've been talking to Derek Thompson, who of course worked alongside him for many years covering horse racing, and he talked as well about how professional he was, how generous, how knowledgeable. How did you find him?
Well, that is the really striking thing. I hope that when people talk in all the obituaries and all the tributes today, they don't just talk about the flamboyant style, because behind that flamboyant style was somebody who knew the sport inside out and back to front. He had been and was a punter, so he was always really keen to champion punters, and if he saw injustice, he wanted to jump on it. He was very knowledgeable, as well, as I've said, and he was actually, for all the bluster and all the brightly coloured outfits, etc., he was a perfectly normal human being, and in every racing media centre that I sat next to him or near him, we chatted about this, that and the other, not just about the type of things that he was famous for. So he was much more than the public persona of John McCririck, though he loved he loved it all. Somebody said to me earlier on, if he saw a red button on the top of a camera, he'd be straight towards it. Where do you want me? When do you want me? I'll be here. And that was absolutely him.
There's a deerstalker that needs a head to sit on. Do you fancy it?
No, but I'll tell you what, his legacy will be many, many things, but one of them will be here at Sandown tomorrow, at Beverley, at Haydock, some of the summer racecourses. There'll be some stag parties around, and people come dressed up to stag parties. Many who come to the races come dressed up with a deer stalker on, the whiskers, and the sort of Sherlock Holmes type outfit as well. So I think there'll be plenty of reminders of John McCririck, both tomorrow amongst the stag parties and in the future as well.
I imagine he would rather like that as a tribute. Cornelius Lycett, thank you very much. The racing pundit John McCririck, who for many years was the face of British horse racing, has died at the age of 79. McCririck made his career as the face of Channel 4's racing coverage and was famous for his loud, eccentric style and his signature deerstalker hat. In later life, he went on to appear on reality TV shows such as Celebrity Big Brother. Sarah Campbell looks back at his life.
Ladbrokes went 4-1, Hills 5-1, Corals 8-1. That's been
with his deerstalker hat, wild gesticulations and memorable turn of phrase. For decades, John McCririck was the face of racing. The sport has lost one of its most colourful characters.
You listened to me and got on!
He was such a massive figure. He was a Marmite figure because there were people who absolutely loved him or couldn't abide him. There was not really anything in between. But for the sport, he was so well known. He was flying the flag for horse racing.
Each way, 1, 2, 3.
First at ITV and then Channel 4, he became a household name explaining the odds. But away from the racecourse, his forthright opinions were often less well received. Even the normally genial Alan Titchmarsh asked him to leave after he insulted a fellow guest. After controversial appearances on reality TV shows, including Celebrity Big Brother,
One condition.
He's French kissing my neck!
he was dropped by Channel 4 from their racing coverage. He lost a subsequent age discrimination tribunal, which determined his pantomime persona and male chauvinist views were unpalatable to audiences. It was a devastating loss to a man who lived for his work. Last year, viewers were shocked by his gaunt appearance following an illness.
Imagine if you woke up no job, or you worked all your lives, and suddenly for whatever reason, either through illness or some of the executives in the suits and the skirts sacked you, what would you do? Having no purpose in life.
Yeah.
It's terrible.
He died less than a year after this interview, survived by Jenny, his wife of 48 years, who he always referred to as the Booby.
And 6-1 first bout, and in places 12-1 today's winner.
Offensive or old-school eccentric. In what he called the betting jungle, John McCririck was king.
John McCririck, who has died at the age of 79.